Seeing that there was a beautiful woman across from him, he quickly picked up a pen and started drawing a portrait. Unexpectedly, the next second, the woman was rude and secretly opened the chocolate he had placed on the table. Then she stuffed it into her mouth and enjoyed it by herself. Cameron was stunned at first, and then he broke off a piece and put it in his mouth as if to declare his sovereignty. He looked at the other person while eating, but the woman not only did not feel embarrassed after bumping into his sight, but smiled and broke off a piece and put it in her mouth. Seeing this, Cameron naturally did not back down, and even pulled the whole bag of chocolate to his side. And this childish behavior made the two people who were pulling each other back and forth laugh at the same time. Cameron felt moved, but when he was about to take the initiative to talk, Poppy just arrived at the station and was about to get off the bus. Helplessly, Cameron could only say that all these chocolates are for you. Unexpectedly, the other party still did not respond, but after getting up and leaving the seat, give him a meaningful smile and look back. It was not until Cameron was about to pack up and get off the bus that he found that his chocolate of the same type was intact in his pocket. Cameron, who learned the truth, woke up from his dream. At this moment, he realized what a ridiculous misunderstanding he had accidentally staged before. I thought that this throbbing of mistake would come to an abrupt end with the separation of the two. But fate always weaves wonderful encounters in its own unique way, as if it was fate that the two met again the next day. Cameron took the lead in explaining the misunderstanding yesterday and gave away the stolen portrait as an apology. However, when he wanted to continue chatting, Poppy was about to get off the bus again. Although Cameron was reluctant in his heart, he could only shake hands and say goodbye with regret. But just when Cameron deeply regretted why he did not ask for contact information just now, Poppy suddenly turned back and gave the painting back, and Cameron didn't know what she meant for a while. It was not until he saw the contact information on the back of the painting that he realized that he had fallen in love with her. In this way, the fate of the two was intertwined. Soon, they formed a family and gave birth to a lovely son a year later. If there were no accidents, they could have been happy like this forever. Unfortunately, there is no if in this world. Cameron was diagnosed with a malignant tumor, and the disease has spread. Since there is no medical cure, he is facing an irreversible end of life. Originally, he also wanted to tell Poppy the bad news, but every time the words were about to come out, he swallowed them back. Because he thought of Poppy's pain because of her brother's death. He also thought of Poppy crying for months and even locking herself in the room for half a year. Cameron knew that Poppy cherished her family and understood her fragile heart. She could no longer bear the blow of losing her loved ones. So Cameron chose to bury this helplessness and fear deep in his heart. But as time went by, his condition was rapidly worsening. He was even on the verge of death. But fortunately, the genetic technology in his world was advancing rapidly, and cloning had been allowed by law. So in order to prevent Poppy from being hit again, and to allow his son to grow up in a family with both parents, he wanted to create a person who was exactly like himself, and continue to accompany Poppy and the child after his death. So Cameron took a boat and came to the experimental base that had been booked in advance. The place was surrounded by clouds and mist, the river was vast, the forests were lush, and it was a peaceful and tranquil scene. Thanks to the widespread application of artificial intelligence technology, most of the work has been efficiently completed by AI. So there were only 3 staff members in the base. After getting a general understanding of the situation of the base, Cameron, led by the doctor in the laboratory, met the clones that had been prepared in advance, but not yet activated. It is reported that every gene in the clone is no different from Cameron, but the DNA has been adjusted to ensure that he will not suffer from the same cancer again. Although he had prepared himself mentally before coming, Cameron still found it hard to accept when he saw his clone, because it was a person who looked exactly like him, and the height, weight, facial contours, and fine lines on the skin were all the same as the mirror image. Not only that, even the touch was so real that Cameron flinched in an instant, because he couldn't accept such a real fake person completely replacing him as a family member of his wife and children. However, when he returned to his family life and saw Poppy and the children laughing and playing around him, he was once again entangled. At the same time, the scene of discussing cloning technology with Poppy flashed in his mind. At that time, Poppy said that no matter what, she couldn't accept that the clone was a real person, but if her mother could sit here and simulate it to the point where she couldn't see it at all, then she would agree to this technology. Thinking of this, Cameron was shaken, so he met with the doctor again, and the doctor told Cameron that there was not much time left. If you don't make a decision now, you will not be able to complete the most important memory replication. Only by successfully completing the memory replication Can the clone forget that he is a clone, and thus complete the life handover cleanly and thoroughly? Of course, the doctor also knows Cameron's concerns about whether the clone can devote himself to his family, so he introduced him to a successful case. The original owner in the case was an Asian single mother. Because she was suffering from a terminal illness and couldn't bear to leave her young daughter, she agreed to accept the cloning experiment. Now, the original owner is living in seclusion in the laboratory, and the clone has successfully taken over her entire life. When Cameron saw the clone, he couldn't see anything abnormal at all. What made Cameron feel relieved was that the clone and the original owner's daughter had a very harmonious relationship, and the atmosphere of getting along was completely like a normal mother and daughter. These warm scenes also made Cameron seem to see in advance that Poppy and his son could have the same happy life with the company of the clone. But even so, Cameron still had concerns, until Poppy suddenly told him that she would welcome another little life. Cameron was completely determined to accept cloning, because he couldn't let his child lose his father just after birth. So Cameron came to the experimental base again, on the pretext of a week-long business trip. Then he started the memory transmission and replication work face-to-face with the clone. In a deep sleep state, all of Cameron's memories flowed into the clone's mind like water. Those memory fragments in life, like ancient scrolls gently brushed by the hand of time, gradually became clear in the clone's consciousness. The sweetness of meeting Poppy until now, the parent-child time with his son, and the beautiful moments of the family of three also flashed one by one like a revolving lantern. As the memory transmission was completed, the clone slowly opened his eyes, and the life trajectories of the two Camerons completely overlapped. But before the two had a face-to-face communication, the doctor first explained the truth to the clone. He also said that the black mole on the clone's hand was the only difference from the original owner, and it was also a sign to remind the clone that he was his. At the same time, Cameron was playing video games with his son online, and the laughter echoed between them through the projection. However, the sudden dizziness was like a claw in the dark, ruthlessly dragging him into the abyss. Fortunately, before he became unconscious, Cameron turned off the video call in time and did not let his son see his unbearable side. But this made Cameron deeply realize that the hourglass of life had run out, and there was not much time left for him. Therefore, when he was notified to meet the clone, he became much calmer than before, although he was a little resistant. But the clone seemed particularly nervous, so much so that he described the birth process incoherently as soon as they met. The clone was in another room in the last second, recalling the last conversation with his father. But the next second, the clone woke up in the laboratory and was told that he was someone else's replacement. Obviously, it was difficult for the clone to accept this reality. After all, in the clone's cognition, he was the real Cameron, and Cameron was at a loss for a moment. Fortunately, he didn't need to participate in the next thing for the time being, and only needed to be an observer on the side. Because the doctor wanted to check again whether the clone's memory was completely accurate, the clone was a little nervous at first when facing the question, but soon calmed down under the guidance of the doctor. As the clone gradually entered the state, the subconscious that was sealed in the old times was also revealed. It turned out that Poppy was a musician, but her job was very special. She used music therapy to help children with learning disabilities. It was because of this that Poppy was particularly eager to have her own children. Cameron used to be a cynical person. He not only didn't think about having children, but also didn't think about getting married. It wasn't until he met Poppy that his stopped life regained its vitality. Listening to another self-telling past memories, Cameron was suddenly frightened, because he felt that the clone was more confident and honest than him, and more courageous to admit his inner weakness and pain. The most important thing is that the clone understands Poppy better than Cameron, and understands what love and understanding are better. After a simple memory correction, Cameron was also asked to participate. This time the doctor asked him to give a few obscure keywords to test whether the clone can recall the relevant details. And the moment Cameron mentioned Andre and the gift, the clone instantly retrieved the picture imprinted in his mind. It was Poppy's birthday, and Andre gave her a piano. She felt very happy at the time. Not long after, Andre unfortunately fell during a mountain motorcycle ride, and was unfortunately hung on a pine tree and died on the spot. Poppy was in agony for the next 6 months, because she hated herself for not stopping Andre from buying a motorcycle. She even closed herself off and refused to communicate with anyone. Although Cameron understood Poppy's feelings, the long-term living in separate rooms still made him, who already lacked security, feel abandoned, and often had nightmares. When the secret buried in his heart was suddenly revealed, Cameron felt at a loss. because these were problems he didn't want to talk about or face. However, what Cameron didn't expect was that the next actual combat exercise was even more difficult to accept. In order to get familiar with the future life in advance, the clone had to call Poppy in front of Cameron. At first, the clone was very nervous, because Cameron said that Poppy's feelings were very accurate, and she could tell whether a person was real or fake in an instant. However, when the video call was dialed and Poppy's face appeared on the screen, the clone suddenly became calm. He smiled and talked to Poppy about the upcoming baby. Immersed in the role, he even forgot that he was actually a clone. Poppy was unaware and laughed happily with the clone. But Cameron, who saw this scene, was jealous and angry as if he saw Poppy cheating, so he forcibly hung up the phone. Unexpectedly, this sudden move instantly angered the clone. The two immediately fell into an argument. The reason why the clone was angry was that everything was going in a good direction, and the cloning plan was about to succeed, allowing Poppy and the child to continue to live happily as usual. But Cameron selfishly tried to end it all, perhaps because he was touched in the sore spot, or perhaps because he was too emotional. Cameron's illness suddenly relapsed, and the argument ended. When Cameron regained consciousness again, the clone took the initiative to find him and apologized for his radical remarks just now. But the clone then advised earnestly that he should think more about the unborn child and make the right choice. Although Cameron knew that continuing the cloning plan was the right choice, but he still couldn't completely let go of his inner grudge. In desperation, the clone could only ask the doctor for help, but the doctor said that according to the contract, she had no right to interfere with Cameron's decision now. Not only that, starting from tomorrow, Cameron will stay at home for 3 days, and there is no way to know whether he will come back to the company later. However, Cameron must wear contact monitoring glasses within the first 3 days of returning home, because the company will conduct a final psychological assessment of the clone through the impression data sent back by Cameron. After all the preparations were ready, Cameron embarked on the journey home with excitement. Along the way, Cameron frequently looked at his watch, looking forward to having dinner with Poppy and the children early. However, some people are happy, while others are worried. The clone is very worried that Cameron will not come back, but he has no qualifications and identity to stop him, so he can only use a pencil to pierce the mole on the palm of his hand. It seems that as long as the mole does not exist, he can become the real Cameron. However, when he was staring at the remote picture on the screen, a huge crisis occurred. As soon as Cameron walked to the door of his house, he suddenly fainted due to the onset of his illness. When he saw the signal interruption, the clone's heartbeat accelerated, as if his heart was in his throat. Because if Cameron died at the door of his house, all the plans would be in vain. Fortunately, Cameron woke up a few minutes later, and then hurriedly struggled to get up and hid in the car. Seeing this, the doctor ordered him to return to the base quickly. Otherwise, when the fainting happened again, it might really cost him his life. Although he was reluctant to leave Poppy in front of him, Cameron knew he had no choice. After returning to the base, Cameron received treatment and then fell into a deep sleep. Since the incident happened suddenly, the doctor had to decide to let the clone go home in Cameron's place early tomorrow morning. In order to stabilize the situation, she also asked the clone to call Poppy that night, claiming that he accidentally slipped and hit his head in the bathroom, so he failed to return home as promised. In this way, the ultimate test of the clone will begin early. The doctor told the clone that if there is no abnormality in the next 2 weeks, the laboratory will erase all his memories of being a clone, and then the clone will be the real Cameron. Hearing this, the clone was both happy and uneasy. He was happy that he was finally no longer a substitute, and he was uneasy about whether he could deal with it freely. However, when the clone wore Cameron's personal belongings and walked into Cameron's house early the next morning, this uneasiness completely disappeared, because Poppy hugged him warmly and obviously did not find any abnormality, which also made the doctor who was closely monitoring all this temporarily relieved. However, the next second, the two panicked at the same time, because the puppy smelled a different smell and kept barking at the clone. Fortunately, Poppy did not doubt it. At the same time, Cameron, who had been in a coma for 24 hours, slowly woke up from the bed in the base. When Cameron learned that the clone had gone home instead of him, Cameron was furious and could not accept it at all, because Cameron felt that he had not agreed yet, and his mission had not been completed. But when he heard the doctor repeatedly remind Cameron that you are dying, he fell into deep powerlessness again. He could only drag his heavy body to the monitoring room and watch every moment of the clone and his family getting along. And when he saw his son and the clone getting along closely, Poppy also opened her heart under the guidance of the clone, crying that she could not leave him and could not lose him. Cameron suddenly felt relieved. As long as Poppy and the child can be happy and safe, it doesn't seem to be that important whether the real him is with them. After thinking through all this, Cameron stopped struggling and became close friends with the Asian single mother who had come to the base earlier. However, as time went by, the Asian mother's condition became worse and worse, perhaps because she had no worries. Even when she was dying, she could still joke with Cameron, but optimism could not stop death. A few days later, her life came to an end, and her ashes were scattered into the deep blue lake and then drifted away with the ripples. Although Cameron was ready to face death, but when he saw death with his own eyes, Cameron began to think about the meaning of life. Like an elegant swan, he began to compose an elegy for life. One day, the song will brush across the folds of the lake, pass over the white heads of the mountains, hover and echo on the treetops, and shine in the fireflies. But people's rationality is always difficult to overcome sensibility. As the clones took off their lenses more and more frequently, Cameron began to become restless. The doctor explained that all clones could not accept it at the beginning, and that they were just tools, so they wanted to take off their lenses. But when this sign began to appear frequently, it meant that the clones had integrated into the current life. Although Cameron was still full of resistance and confusion, whenever he thought of the happy smiles of his wife and children, he swallowed all his doubts and dissatisfaction. But even if he chose to endure and sacrifice his feelings, the uneasy emotion was still surging like an undercurrent, ready to break through his surface calmness at any time. Finally, on this quiet night, the emotion turned into a nightmare and made him fall into deep fear. In the dream, Cameron saw the clones lose control of their emotions and began to treat his wife and children violently. After waking up, Cameron remembered that every time the clones took off their glasses, the ambiguous eyes seemed to become cruel and fierce. Unable to bear it any longer, Cameron decided to do something, so he sneaked into the doctor's office that night and then found a key after searching for a while. Then he took the key and stepped on the cold autumn wind in the quiet night, started the yacht, and fled the base overnight. He had to go home immediately to confirm the safety of his wife and children, but when he arrived at the door of his house, he didn't dare to go in. It was not until he had been mentally prepared for a long time outside the door that he tiptoed to open the door. As it was late at night, Cameron did not visit his family immediately, but came to the studio on the second floor. As an artist, he usually paints here with poetic and picturesque brushstrokes. At first, he thought that this place would become messy after not coming for a long time. Unexpectedly, not only everything was normal, but even more orderly than before, which also meant that the clones had been continuing his work. Not only that, the paintings on the desk were obviously the more imaginative and creative works that Cameron wanted. If the mind is not calm and the mood is stable, it is absolutely impossible to create successfully. After appreciating the painting, Cameron opened the chat history between the clone and Poppy. There was no quarrel or indifference in it, only warm words and delicate care. At this moment, Cameron completely understood that the clone had been loving Poppy on his behalf. However, just when he was immersed in comfort, the clone suddenly appeared behind him. It turned out that shortly after Cameron arrived, the clone suddenly opened his eyes from sleep as if he had sensed something. The clone thought that Cameron would ignore the provisions of the agreement and come to visit Poppy and the child privately. But when the eyes met, he was still startled, because Cameron's eyes were full of fear and astonishment. Like a frightened, trapped beast, he showed a strict defensive posture. But the clone understood his defense and knew his demands clearly. So after calming down, he spoke first and said, "Go and say the final goodbye to Poppy and his son." After hearing this, Cameron relaxed his guard instantly. In order not to be discovered, they returned to the living room quietly. But at this moment, the puppy suddenly ran over. Seeing the two identical owners in front of him, its dog life fell into confusion. But fortunately, it did not make a sound, after a dangerous episode. The clone locked himself in the closet, while Cameron changed his clothes and put on the ring, and returned to his original identity. Then Cameron woke up his son first, and then the father and son went to the balcony to drink and talk. Looking at his son, immersed in joy, Cameron's originally smiling face was unconsciously covered with tears. How Cameron wanted to grow up with this little guy like an ordinary father. But for the rest of his life, the child grew from childhood to adolescence, and then to a man's 30s. He could no longer see it. So he could only celebrate his son's happy event in advance by drinking a drink at this moment. After bidding farewell to his son, Cameron went to the bedroom and hugged Poppy tightly, as if he wanted to integrate all his love and reluctance into this intimacy. At the same time, The sweet memories of Cameron and Poppy all quietly emerged before his eyes. Cameron hated that his love for Poppy rose with the wind, but he could not accompany her to the end. But Cameron was also glad that he insisted on completing the cloning plan at the end of his life, because the clone not only filled his vacancy, but also perfectly maintained the existing happiness of his wife and children. Finally, Cameron also said to Poppy, who woke up, that if the fetus in her belly was a boy, then name it Andre. Obviously, Poppy had the same plan. After all, this name meant rebirth. As Poppy's breathing became even beside his ear, Cameron completely completed the final farewell. Before leaving, he solemnly handed the wedding ring of extraordinary significance to the clone. This also means that Cameron is willing to give his life to others. Soon, the 2-week test period ended. The clone also had his memory deleted in the laboratory and officially took over Cameron's life. Although he had been prepared to be removed, Cameron still felt a little disappointed when he heard the news in person. After all, being forgotten is always painful, but Cameron soon reached a reconciliation with himself. Because before his memory was deleted, the clone used contact lenses to shoot a video for him. It was a sunny morning, and Poppy was preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Suddenly, the clone asked her to look into his eyes and said, "I love you," solemnly and affectionately. And Poppy also cooperated lovingly. In this way, through the eyes of one person, both of them received Poppy's most sincere love. Some people say that human life is one moment after another, and this moment is undoubtedly the moment that Cameron wants to keep the most. Because of this moment, Cameron really felt that his choice was not let down. Swan Elegy is directed by Benjamin Cleary, starring Mahershala Ali and Naomi Harris, a drama film released in 2021. After learning that his life was about to come to an end, Cameron decided to let the clone accompany Poppy and the child for the rest of his life. But when the clone really appeared and replaced himself little by little, Cameron's heart fell into endless tearing and torture. Because he couldn't stand his family being suddenly interfered with by strangers. He can't stand his wife's sweet interaction with another man. He can't stand his true self being completely forgotten, so he began to imagine all kinds of potential dangers, trying to convince himself to give up the cloning plan. However, the shock that technology brings to mankind is that it can not only perfectly replicate the original owner, but also weaken the shortcomings and strengthen the advantages on the basis of the original owner. It is precisely because of this that the clones have assumed his responsibilities more perfectly than Cameron, and when Cameron recognizes this reality, he completely accepts the existence of clones. Because he loves Poppy and the children deeply, if someone can give them more care after his death, he is willing to be forgotten. Well, today's movie sharing is here. Welcome to like, comment, and forward. Thank you for your patience. Looking forward to meeting you next time.